Hello, Fernie. If you can hear my voice, you will be the first person to receive wireless telephony in an aeroplane.
Your voice is audible above the noise of the engine.
Hello, Fernie. Can you dip your wings?
With your photographs of Kitty Hawk and the biplanes on your wall, you were always Amy Johnson from the time that you were small. No schoolroom kept you grounded while your thoughts could get away. You were taking off in tiger moths, your wings against the brushstrokes of the day. Are you there on the tarmac with the winter in your hair? By the empty hangar doors you stop and stare. Leave the oil drums behind you, they won't care. Oh, are you there?
Signals. Golf Bravo 1, Brooklands Museum, calling secure listening. Golf Bravo 1, Bravo Mexico. Golf Bravo 1, Brooklands Museum, calling secure and listening.
Hi, my name is Dr. Elizabeth Burton. I'm a curator at the Museum of History Science, and I'm here at the Brooklands Museum to celebrate the centenary of the first radio telephony experiments in aircraft, which took place at Brooklands, which was an experimental site for the Marconi Company as well as the Royal Flying Corps, and this was in June, late June 1915. Now behind me here I have a Mark III shortwave tuner, and this would have been the set that would have been used by the artillery to intercept and to listen to the wireless transmissions being sent from aircraft during this period. So the development of communications in aircraft during World War I is absolutely fascinating. While the Royal Flying Corps and indeed civilian aviators had experimented with wireless telegraphy, that is Morse code over wireless, in various forms in aircraft during World War I, when war broke out in August 1914, the Royal Flying Corps had 63 aircraft that it sent to France, one of which was capable of using wireless communications. But this changed quite rapidly during the war. So Major Hugh Dowding, or Stuffy Dowding as he was known, was in charge of the wireless equipped aircraft. Gradually they started to have more, 2 and then 4, and that these would be lent out to various squadrons, mostly for the purpose of artillery observation as well as reconnaissance. But it quickly became apparent that wireless communications in aircraft was a tricky problem to solve. It was difficult to fly the plane and listen to and operate wireless telegraphy sets using Morse code. There were issues in terms of the heaviness of sets as well as the power required to operate them. So Dowding, along with the squadron, was sent back to Britain in early 1915 to figure out a solution to this problem. So they did tests with lots of different apparatus. Were they going to use continuous wave or not? Would they use radio valves or not? And eventually here at Brooklands in April 1915 they came up with a set that used radio valves to successfully develop a system from ground to air. But they also had a clear need for a system that worked from air to ground. And it was a few months later, in late June 1915, that they came up with the set, and that is what we're celebrating here today. These sets were in industrial production fairly rapidly because there was a clear and urgent necessity for these sets, and the Marconi Company and other wireless companies continued to work closely with the military, including the Royal Flying Corps, later RAF, to develop the sets. So by the end of the war, having successfully developed noise insulating earphones as well, which is a key component in the apparatus, they had systems of radio telephony that were capable of communicating over distances between two planes of about 10 miles and from air to ground of 50 miles, which is about as long as they needed. Anything longer than that and you risked problems of interference and interception. By the end of the war, the Royal Flying Corps, well, it was now the Royal Air Force as of April 1918, had over 7,000 wireless operators and pilots who were working in the field of wireless communications. And after the war, this had a massive impact. You had the development of civilian air traffic control, as well as wireless equipped civilian aircraft, in addition to the military aircraft. And many of the wireless operators who came home after the war were able to buy cheap sets, such as the Mark III behind me, and use it to listen to very early experimental broadcast radio. Initially, this would have involved the licensed wireless amateurs, but later in the early 1920s, you had the development of the BBC. And indeed, many of the sets that they used the technology and radio valves that had been developed for airborne radio telephony during World War I, as well as the expertise and indeed some of the operators.
The main topics we're going to try and cover are aircraft radio equipment and systems, the environment and the problems that gives, a bit about propagation, a bit about the flight deck, and then VHF radio and HF radio, and we'll finish, if we get time, with emergency location. Why do we need radio? There are sort of 5 phases of most aeroplane flights. You start off on the ground, which is the first O. You then have a takeoff and departure, which is the second O for off. And then en route, we need radio, particularly for remote location, so the air traffic control know where the aircraft are. The actual aircraft operator knows where his planes are. And then arrival and landing, which is the last O. We need voice, particularly from the aircraft to ground control. And then on the ground, so that it knows where to go when it's on the airfield at its destination. So that's the effects that lightning can have. And the other problem is hail. Lumps of ice causing damage, particularly to the very front. If you think about it, the airflow over the aircraft means it's only really the nose cone that's going to get hit by hail. Because once you get up to the windscreen, you've got a rush of air going over, so the ice blocks don't actually hit the aircraft. So it's only the nose cone itself that becomes susceptible to hail. And then noise, and I don't really mean acoustic noise, I mean radio noise. There's cables all over an aircraft, and so the radio equipment, which is also all together usually in a modern aircraft, HF, VHF, all the various transponders are all lumped together, so there's a lot of RF noise which doesn't help the environment in terms of trying to receive radio signals.
I think if you come away with nothing other than a few facts about the place, there's some key facts in a moment, but I'm sure most of you know Brooklands was the world's first purpose-built racing circuit, or banked racing circuit you could argue if you want to be a bit careful about the definition. It was also one of Britain's first airfields. Even that's, again, you've got to be careful. Farnborough can claim it, and the Isle of Sheppey is also an early pioneer in aviation centre. But this is where buildings started to be built in 1909, and flying started to take place regularly with increasing numbers of pioneers, including people like Sopwith and A.V. Rowe, so we'll more of which in a moment. But ultimately it became a massive centre for the aircraft industry, and the museum is really telling the story of that, not only the racing history and the history of the site as a social centre as well, but the aviation story, and we'll see more of that in a moment. Archive picture often used and published, and you'll see it given a variety of dates. That's actually 12th of January 1939, very much as war was being prepared for here. the site hadn't actually been camouflaged very well, which is a shame, but it was, you can see Hurricanes parked on the apron. These were the Hawker flight sheds, Hawker assembly line, and the Vickers factory over here. And there was a flying school in the centre hangar, and some Vickers flight sheds in the other end of that. What looks like ploughed fields is actually the famous Brooklands sewage farm, which in the very early days was famous for a downdraft over it would often catch a trainee pilot unawares, and if you've seen the magnificent men in their flying machines film, that was depicted in there quite accurately. But also Britain's largest centre for flying training before the First World War, and a major centre in between the wars as well for people who learned to fly. Battle of Britain pilots and First World War pilots were trained here. More pilots trained here before 1914, the outbreak of the First World War, than anywhere else. And the statistic, which is also on the plaque on the front of the clubhouse, over 18,500 aircraft at nearly 260 different types were actually built and first flown here, which the more we've investigated that, so we can't find anywhere else in Britain or even Europe that can compete with that claim. So it's quite a place in that sense. Not a crossover between motor and aviation. We'll go into some aircraft history now. The famous test pilot Harry Hawker, whose Hawker Aircraft Company was named after him after he was killed in a crash in 1921. But he was very much into motorcycles and cars as well as aeroplanes. He often competed in a Sunbeam, seen here on the members' banking. And the first pioneer to try and get off the ground with a full-size aeroplane was A.V. Rowe, Alec Verdon Rowe. The Avro company was later named after him. He sold his interest in it at a later date and became part of Saunders Rowe in the late 1920s. The famous Sopwith Camel, of course, the most successful Allied fighter of the First World War. Built here in some numbers, but a lot of subcontracts were brought in. Sopwith couldn't keep up with the demand, and their factory was also building other prototypes and other things like the triplane and the pup, to name but two. So Camels were often built by other places all around the country. I think just over 500 were built here, but they shot down more than 5,000 enemy aircraft during the First World War. The Vickers factory is the one that had the longest sort of period of occupation at Brooklands, eventually becoming part of BAC and British Aerospace, now BA Systems. They had factories and another test airfield in Kent, near Dartford and Crayford. Gun bus, not many of them actually built and not many built here, but that's a replica that was built here in the 60s and is now on display at the RF Museum. We'd like to borrow it sometime if we ever got the chance. But they tried various prototypes and limited success, I guess, with orders, but the first big contract they got was to actually build a BE-2Cs under contract from Farnborough. It was a Farnborough-designed aircraft. That's a replica that's recently been brought to the UK by the film director Peter Jackson, and there's two in the UK like this. We did try and see if we could get one to fly over today, but unfortunately not available. But we'll keep trying to get one later in the year for an aviation event here. That's the kind of aircraft that some of this equipment would have been used in, which we're pleased to see on display here. So Vickers built about 75 BE-2s, the first contract they had in their factory, which they took over an existing car assembly plant in 1915, and then in 1916 they got a big contract to build 1,650 of these, the RF SE-5, contemporary and sort of almost rival of the Sopwith Camel. It was a bit like the Hurricane is to the Spitfire in the Second World War. But,
So April 1912, the Royal Flying Corps is established, and on the 12th of May 1912, so about a month later, the world's first successful two-way wireless transmission, that is ground to air and air to ground, was made by A.W. Matthew with a Marconi receiver fitted in a Flanders F3 monoplane flying over Brooklands. So we're not quite sure when the wireless experiments began here in Brooklands. I would say it probably dates back to as much as the early aircraft were, but the archive material is not quite certain as to when it began. But it shows that they were testing wireless equipped aircraft here at Brooklands. I'd say from about 1910 onwards, but I need to delve in a little further to see if I can get some exact dates. And in 1913, Brooklands Automobile Racing Club granted a 3-year lease on number 7 shed to the Royal Flying Corps. So by now you've got the Marconi Company has an establishment here, and also the Royal Flying Corps. So in 1913, Lieutenant Baron T. James of the Royal Flying Corps received a wireless telegraphy signal in a BE aircraft flying at full power which was fitted with Captain Lefroy, who I've mentioned previously, who previously the Royal Engineers, a new receiving set in which magnetodisturbances were screened off and signals strengthened by Brown microphone relays. So it's quite interesting if you ever see one of these surviving Brown microphone relays. It's essentially the most sensitive relay you can get, originally used in telephone systems, but also used to amplify signals in wireless telegraphy systems as well as telegraph systems more generally. So in June 1914, friends and both Royal Flying Corps Lieutenants Donald Swain and Baron T. Lewis, who would come up sort of for most of this period in sort of between 1913 and 1914, both in aircraft fitted with sending and receiving apparatus, flew from Netherhaven to Bournemouth while keeping in close wireless communications and flying 10 miles apart. So we start to have air-to-air communications, even if it is by Morse code. Yet again, these are using screened spark gap sets. So while there aren't any descriptions of aircraft, being put on fire with these systems, it's quite dangerous, potentially dangerous at least. You have an aircraft with a lot of petrol fumes, you have heavily doped and therefore very sort of flammable wings, and you have a spark set. So it's quite a dangerous occupation, as flying in general was during this period. So in July 1914, the naval wing of the Royal Flying Corps is reorganised to become the Royal Naval Air Service. And so for the rest of this talk, I'm going to focus mostly on the wireless experiments conducted by and in the Royal Flying Corps, as the Royal Naval Air Service had quite different demands and sort of to a certain degree went off on their own parallel developments. So nonetheless, even though they'd done a lot of experimenting, and indeed that there was a lot of expertise and innovation within the Royal Flying Corps in terms of wireless signalling, there wasn't very much practical implementation. There was immense appreciation for it, and a lot of experimentation and demonstration, but in terms of actually wireless equipped aircraft which were capable of operational use, it wasn't quite representative of their enthusiasm and work that they'd done pre-war. So in August 1914, when war breaks out, the Royal Flying Corps takes over the Marconi experimental establishment at Brooklands, which was headed by R.D. Bangay. And indeed, on the battlefront across in France, wireless communications is experimented with and for artillery spotting and reconnaissance. So you can see here, the picture here at the top is an early ground demonstration of wireless telegraphy by the Royal Flying Corps. And unfortunately, I haven't necessarily been able to get dates for this.
The sun comes up on Icarus as the night birds sail away, and lights the maps and diagrams that Leonardo makes. You can see faith, hope and charity as they bank above the fields. You can join the flying circus, you can touch the morning air against your wheels. Are you there? Do you have a thought for me that you can share? Oh, I never thought you'd take me unawares. Just call me if you ever need repairs. Oh, are you there?
Walked off again.